The probate records from Greene County, Alabama, dated October 1839, include an inventory of personal property belonging to the estate of Nathaniel Crawford Harrington, who died at the age of 47, alongside the usual listings of furniture, livestock, farming tools, and 127 enslaved people valued at $89,400. There appears a strange entry that the court clerk first marked for further review, but later accepted without any explanation. The line states, 6 hunting dogs specially trained of considerable value for specialized purposes, destroyed by order of executive. No valuation assigned. What those special purposes were and why animals considered valuable were killed instead of being sold or given away only becomes clear after examining private letters, sworn testimonies sealed by court order, and the frightened accounts preserved by enslaved people who witnessed what happened that fall. This is the story of how Nathaniel Harrington's obsession with creating perfect tools for hunting human beings led to a tragedy that destroyed not only his own son, but also revealed the deep moral decay at the center of Alabama's plantation system. Before continuing with this account of how a wealthy planter's cruelty came back upon his own family in the most terrible way imaginable, I want to invite you to join our community that is committed to uncovering these painful truths. Subscribe to Real Stories of Slavery and turn on the notification bell so you never miss these important chapters of American history. Please leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We truly enjoy hearing where our audience connects from. Now, let us look closely at what took place on the Harrington plantation in Greene County, Alabama, during the autumn of 1839, when a system of fear designed to enforce total control turned against its creator in ways he never expected. Nathaniel Crawford Harrington had built his wealth through harsh efficiency and an unshakable belief in his right to rule over land and people alike. Born in 1792 to a reasonably successful planter family in Virginia, Nathaniel quickly realized that the growing cotton lands of Alabama offered opportunity for men willing to be more ruthless than others. He arrived in Greene County in 1818 with borrowed money, bought 800 acres at low prices from Creek families being pushed westward, and immediately began building his cotton operation piece by piece. By 1825, he owned 2,400 acres of rich black belt soil. By 1830, his land had grown to 4,200 acres, worked by 89 enslaved people. By 1835, he controlled 6,800 acres and held 127 enslaved people, placing him among the wealthiest planters in the area. His yearly cotton output exceeded 600 bales, bringing in profits that allowed him to live according to the aristocratic image he carefully cultivated. His plantation house, finished in 1833, was a Greek Revival mansion with 16 rooms, imported furnishings, and a wine cellar filled with European wines. He employed 1 overseer, 3 assistant overseers, and kept the largest group of hunting dogs in the county. Nathaniel married Catherine Morrison in 1820, the daughter of a merchant family from Charleston. Together they had 4 children: William, born in 1821, Nathaniel Jr., born in 1823, Elizabeth, born in 1826, and Thomas, born in 1828. Catherine died in 1834 due to complications after a miscarriage, leaving Nathaniel to raise the children with help from his sister Margaret, who moved to the plantation to run the household. From the outside, Nathaniel Harrington appeared to be a successful and respected man, wealthy, influential in county matters, and secure in his social standing. Yet beneath this polished surface was a personality shaped by cruelty, fear, and an obsessive need for total control, traits that would eventually destroy both him and his family. The dogs that would later tear apart Nathaniel's world were first purchased for ordinary hunting. In 1828, he bought 3 bloodhounds from a breeder in South Carolina, paying high prices for animals with proven tracking skills and documented bloodlines. These dogs, named Caesar, Brutus, and Nero, were meant to hunt deer, bear, and other game in the wooded areas surrounding his fields. But sometime around 1831, Nathaniel began testing a different use for their abilities. The exact reason is unclear, but Evidence suggests it followed an incident in which 2 enslaved people escaped from the Harrington plantation and avoided capture for 3 weeks before being found in Mississippi. The escape was costly. Each person was valued at about $1,200, and their absence during planting season meant lost labor. More importantly, their successful escape damaged Nathaniel's authority and reputation among other planters. In Alabama's Black Belt Society, a planter's control over enslaved people was seen as proof of his strength and competence. Escapes were humiliating signs of weakness. Nathaniel answered this humiliation by deciding his hunting dogs would serve another purpose. If bloodhounds could track animals through miles of forest, they could track people as well. He began retraining Caesar, Brutus, and Nero for this role, using methods that were deliberate and brutal. According to sealed testimony later given by the plantation overseer, Samuel Hawkins, the training involved linking human sense to rewards. Nathaniel collected clothing worn by enslaved people and used them to lay scent trails. At first, the dogs followed the trails to food rewards like meat scraps and bones. Over time, however, Nathaniel added a darker element. The trails began to end with live people, enslaved individuals ordered to stand still as the dogs approached. Teaching the animals to see human scent as prey, the training grew more extreme. By 1832, the dogs were rewarded not only for tracking but for attacking. Enslaved people were forced to run set distances, while the dogs were released to chase them. When the dogs caught their targets, they were encouraged to bite and hold, reinforcing violent behavior. Those forced to take part suffered injuries from the attacks and deep psychological damage from being treated as tools. By 1833, Caesar, Brutus, and Nero were no longer simple hunting dogs but weapons trained specifically to hunt human beings. Still, Nathaniel wanted more. He wanted a larger pack and a stronger threat that would crush any thought of escape. Between 1833 and 1836, he acquired 3 more bloodhounds named Hannibal, Spartacus, and Augustus, and subjected them to the same training. By 1836, Nathaniel Harrington owned 6 dogs conditioned to track, chase, and attack people. The sound of their howling alone spread fear among enslaved people on his plantation and nearby ones. The effect of these dogs on the enslaved community was severe and far-reaching. Most immediately, they removed escape as a realistic option. Before the dogs, people held on to the hope that careful planning and luck might lead to freedom. The dogs destroyed that hope. They could follow a trail through water, thick forest, and long distances that would take days to walk. Once released, they did not stop. When they caught someone, they attacked with such violence that survivors were left with lasting scars, inside and out. Between 1833 and 1839, the dogs were used at least 17 times to hunt P.O. Plea, who tried to escape. 16 of those chases ended in capture. On average, it took less than 8 hours from release to capture. Only one man, named Joshua, escaped by reaching the Tombigbee River and stealing a boat, putting enough water between himself and the dogs to break the trail. His escape was rare. In most cases, running meant being hunted by dogs trained to treat humans as animals. Beyond actual chases, the dogs created constant fear. Enslaved people lived knowing the dogs were always nearby, always ready to be unleashed. This fear acted as ongoing terror, making every moment unsafe and escape seem impossible, reinforcing Nathaniel's absolute power. Other planters in Greene County noticed how effective the dogs were and began asking to borrow them. Nathaniel agreed at times, building a web of fear and obligation across plantations. The Harrington dogs became infamous throughout the region, praised by planters as tools of control and feared by enslaved people as symbols of violence. Nathaniel himself took visible pride in what he had created. He took great pride in his dogs. He often brought them to social events, showed off how well they could track people, and talked in detail with other planters about how they were trained. To him, the dogs were not just animals. He saw them as extensions of his own strength and sharp mind, living proof that he had a superior ability to enforce order and discipline. His sons, especially William and Nathaniel Jr., grew up watching how their father treated the dogs and how much importance he placed on them. Over time, they learned to see the dogs as normal and even impressive tools for keeping control over the plantation. This acceptance of animals trained to hunt and attack human beings slowly became part of the Harrington family's everyday thinking. What should have been shocking or disturbing was treated as ordinary. This family mindset would later lead to terrible consequences. William Harrington, Nathaniel's oldest son, was 18 years old in 1839. From an early age, he had been carefully prepared to one day take over the plantation. He was taught by private tutors, learned how cotton production worked, studied the finances of plantation life, and closely observed how his father managed people and land. As he grew older, he was given more responsibility. By 1839, William was acting as an assistant to the overseer. He helped manage field work, enforced discipline among the enslaved workers, and showed that he was capable of handling the duties required of a future owner. William's character showed many similarities to his father, but also some important differences that created tension between them. Like Nathaniel, William fully believed he had the right to own other human beings. He accepted the racial ideas used to justify slavery and saw enslaved people as property that needed to be controlled efficiently. However, unlike his father, William did not have the same cruel enjoyment of suffering. His harshness was more administrative than personal. He ordered punishments when he believed they were needed to keep productivity high, but he did not seem to enjoy causing pain the way Nathaniel did. This difference was clear in how William felt about the dogs. He understood their usefulness as tools of control and had helped use them before, but he kept an emotional distance from them. To William, they were tools, not symbols of his own power. He did not share his father's pride in their violence or his pleasure in showing off their abilities. This small but meaningful difference would later become very important. In August of 1839, William became romantically involved with a young woman his father strongly disapproved of. Her name was Sarah Blackwell, and she was the daughter of a neighboring planter. Her father, Robert Blackwell, had fallen on hard financial times. Over the years, he had lost parts of his property to creditors and was widely seen as a man whose influence in local society was fading. Nathaniel believed that any connection with the Blackwell family would damage the Harrington family's social status. He saw the relationship as a step backward and refused to accept it. William did not agree with his father's view. He truly cared for Sarah and believed that her family's financial troubles should not matter more than real affection. He also deeply resented his father's attempt to control his personal life. By September 1839, this disagreement had grown into the most serious conflict William and Nathaniel had ever had. Nathaniel ordered William to stop seeing Sarah immediately and demanded that he focus only on plantation work. William pretended to obey in public, but continued to meet Sarah in secret. When Nathaniel discovered the truth in late September, his anger exploded. The confrontation that followed showed how deeply Nathaniel needed total control and how unable he was to accept any challenge, even from his own son. The exact details of what happened on September 28, 1839, were later pieced together from statements given by several people. These included the overseer, Samuel Hawkins, Nathaniel's sister Margaret, and several enslaved individuals who were nearby when the argument took place. The confrontation began around 2 in the afternoon in Nathaniel's study. William had just returned from what Nathaniel believed was another hidden meeting with Sarah Blackwell. Nathaniel demanded to know where William had been. William tried to avoid answering directly and said he had been checking fences along the northern edge of the property. Nathaniel did not believe him and continued pressing for the truth. The argument quickly grew more intense. Nathaniel accused William of disobedience, of bringing shame to the family, and of showing weakness that proved he was unfit to inherit the plantation. William fired back with accusations of his own. He called his father a tyrant, said his need for control had damaged their family, and claimed that his cruelty toward enslaved people went too far even compared to other planters. This accusation was especially dangerous. William was saying that his father's behavior was not just normal brutality, but something darker and more extreme. He pointed directly to the dogs, saying they were signs of Nathaniel's cruelty, not practical tools. For Nathaniel, this struck at the heart of how he saw himself. He believed the dogs showed his strength and intelligence, not his savagery. Hearing his own son challenge this belief was unbearable. The argument turned physical. Witnesses later said that Nathaniel slapped William across the face. William, young and strong from years of hard work, reacted without thinking and pushed his father back. Nathaniel stumbled but stayed on his feet. For a brief moment, the two stood facing each other, a powerful image of generational conflict and the violence that defined plantation life. Then Nathaniel shouted for William to get out of his sight. He ordered him to leave the main house and not come back until he was ready to apologize and fully submit to his father's authority. William left in anger and shame, walking toward the overseer's cabin where he sometimes stayed when working late. This was around 3:30 in the afternoon on September 28, 1839. What happened after this would turn a family fight into a tragedy that revealed the deep moral failure of the entire system Nathaniel had created. After the confrontation, Nathaniel stayed in his study, drinking whiskey and replaying the argument in his mind. Instead of calming down, his anger grew stronger. His rage mixed hurt feelings with fury over being challenged. Around 5 in the evening, his sister Margaret tried to speak with him. She suggested that he might be too severe, that William was only 18 and naturally wanted some freedom, especially in matters of love. Nathaniel dismissed her words completely. To him, her suggestion only proved that others failed to understand how important absolute authority was. By 6 in the evening, Nathaniel made a choice that would ruin his family and define the rest of his life. He decided to teach William a lesson about obedience, power, and the consequences of defiance on the Harrington plantation. He chose to use the same method he always used when someone under his control stepped out of line. He would use the dogs. Later, Samuel Hawkins testified that around 6:30 that evening Nathaniel called him to the kennels and gave him clear instructions. Nathaniel said that William had left the house without permission and needed to be found and brought back at once. Hawkins was told to take all 6 dogs and follow William's trail from the main house to wherever he was hiding. When the dogs found William, they were to bring him down and hold him there until Hawkins could tie him with ropes. After that, Hawkins was to drag William back to the house, restrained, when Nathaniel would decide on the punishment. Hawkins later admitted he felt uneasy about the orders. He knew William had not truly run away and was likely just at the overseer's cabin. He knew William was Nathaniel's son, not an enslaved person trying to escape. He also suspected that Nathaniel's anger and drinking had clouded his judgment. But Hawkins also understood that his job and reputation depended on obeying orders without question. Any refusal or hesitation could cost him everything, so he followed the command. At about 7 in the evening on September 28, 1839, Samuel Hawkins released 6 bloodhounds trained specifically to hunt and attack human beings. Using a shirt Nathaniel provided to give them William's scent, he set them loose on the path leading from the main house toward the overseer's cabin. During this time, William Harrington was sitting in the overseer's cabin, trying to settle his emotions and decide what to do next. He felt torn between his love for his father and his anger at his father's control, between his feelings for Sarah Blackwell and his fear of losing his future and inheritance. As evening approached, William decided that the next morning he would return to the main house. He planned to speak calmly, try to reason with his father, and look for a compromise that would let him stay connected to Sarah without completely breaking ties with his family. That decision came too late. Around 7:15 in the evening, William heard sounds that puzzled him at first. Dogs were howling in the distance, moving quickly closer. At RST, he thought his father had decided to go hunting at a strange hour, since evening was not a normal time for that kind of activity. Then the noises became louder and more hostile, and William slowly realized that something was not right. He stepped outside the overseer's cabin to see what was happening. What he witnessed would become his last clear memory before the attack began. 6 large bloodhounds, the same dogs he had grown up with, the same animals he had seen used many times to hunt down enslaved people who tried to escape, were charging straight toward him with the intense focus they always showed when chasing a target. According to witnesses watching from a distance, William's first response was confusion, not fear. These dogs belonged to his father. He had known them his entire life. He had fed them, helped with their training, and watched them work again and again. They knew him. They had never shown any aggression toward him before. He believed they would recognize him and stop. That belief would turn out to be horribly wrong. The dogs had been trained for years to connect certain actions with prey, running, fleeing, backing away, and showing fear. They had been conditioned to attack people who behaved this way. Most importantly, They had been released with clear instructions to follow a human scent, and Hawkins's excited commands told them this was a real hunt and a proper use of their training. When William saw the dogs closing in and instinctive, stepped backward toward the cabin door. He set off the exact prey signals the dogs had been trained to respond to. The pack reached him within seconds. What followed was the same outcome that occurred whenever these dogs caught someone they were sent after. They attacked with the violence and skill they had been taught. Caesar, the lead dog and the most aggressive, reached William first and jumped at him, clamping his powerful jaws onto William's left forearm as William raised it to protect himself. The impact knocked William off balance and backward. Before he could regain his footing, Brutus and Nero were on him, tearing at his legs and trying to drag him down. William screamed for help, tried to fight them off, and even attempted to shout commands that might make them stop. But the dogs were no longer thinking. They were acting on instinct and training, focused on the scent they had been given, the chase they had been released to complete, and the violent movements William made while trying to defend himself. Within 30 seconds of the first contact, William was on the ground with all 6 dogs attacking him at once. Samuel Hawkins arrived at the scene about 1 minute after the dogs reached William. What he saw was a nightmare that stayed with him for the rest of his life. William lay on the ground, soaked in blood, desperately trying to shield his throat and face, while 6 dogs ripped at his arms, legs, and body. Hawkins immediately realized the terrible mistake that had been made and began shouting for the dogs to stop. But they were fully locked into attack mode, driven by the training and instincts that had been intentionally built into them. Calling them off was not enough. Physical force was required. Hawkins rushed into the pack with a heavy stick, swinging at the dogs and trying to force them away from William. The dogs fought back. They had been trained to hold their target until given very specific release commands, and Hawkins's attempts to beat them off were treated as interference that needed to be overcome. Nearly 2 full minutes of intense physical struggle passed before Hawkins finally managed to pull the dogs away from William. By then, others had arrived, drawn by William's screams and the sounds of the attack. 3 enslaved men working in nearby fields reached the area and helped Hawkins restrain the dogs. Nathaniel's sister Margaret arrived and saw her nephew lying in a pool of blood, his injuries clearly life-threatening. Soon after, Nathaniel himself arrived, having been pulled from the main house by the chaos. He expected to find his son frightened or humbled by being tracked by the dogs. He did not understand what his orders had truly set into motion. The sight that greeted Nathaniel shattered his world instantly. His oldest son, his heir, the young man he had prepared for years to carry on the Harrington family name, lay on the ground with devastating injuries from the dogs. Both of William's arms were badly to RN, with deep cuts and likely broken bones. His left leg was shredded, with muscle and possibly bone exposed. His hands and face showed defensive wounds where he had tried to protect himself. Most alarming of all was a wound to his throat, where one of the dogs had managed to get a grip that was often fatal when used on escaping enslaved people. Blood pooled beneath him fast, showing that a major artery had been damaged. Margaret immediately began giving what first aid she could, pressing cloth against the worst wounds, calling for water and bandages, and directing the enslaved people who had gathered to help. Even as she worked, she knew that William's injuries were likely far beyond what their rural Alabama plantation could handle. The nearest doctor lived in Utah, 8 miles away. It would take at least an hour to send for him and have him arrive. William might not last that long. Nathaniel stood motionless, unable to fully understand what had happened. He had ordered the dogs released, expecting them to track William, scare him, maybe knock him down and hold him until Hawkins arrived. He had never meant for them to attack with the same brutality they used on enslaved people trying to escape. But the dogs could not tell the difference between targets. They were trained to attack anyone who ran or resisted. William, faced with 6 large and violent animals, reacted as any human would. He tried to defend himself and get away. The dogs responded exactly as they had been trained. To respond. Nathaniel had created tools of terror so effective that they turned on his own son without hesitation. William Harrington died at around 9:30 that evening on September 28, 1839, roughly 2 hours after the attack by his father's dogs. A doctor arrived from Utah later that night, but there was nothing left to do except confirm the death and examine the body. The doctor's report to the county coroner listed the cause of death as massive blood loss from multiple traumatic injuries consistent with an animal attack. The report recorded more than 40 separate wounds on William's body, including the fatal throat injury that had severed his carotid artery. In private letters later discovered by researchers, the doctor wrote that he had never seen injuries this severe on a white person before, though he had treated several enslaved people who survived dog attacks with similar but less extensive wounds. The immediate aftermath of William's death caused a crisis that threatened to reveal the full truth of what had happened. Many witnesses had seen the attack, including enslaved people who clearly understood what had occurred and why. Samuel Hawkins knew he had followed Nathaniel's direct orders in releasing the dogs. Margaret Harrington had arrived in time to watch her nephew die from injuries caused by animals her brother had intentionally trained for this exact purpose. Nathaniel's two younger sons, Nathaniel Jr. and Thomas, learned what had happened and understood the consequences. All of these people held knowledge that, if spoken openly, would ruin Nathaniel Harrington's reputation, social standing, and possibly his freedom. The next 24 hours were filled with desperate attempts to create a story that would protect the family from the full fallout. Nathaniel, slowly coming out of shock, began pushing a version of events that removed his responsibility. He claimed that William had been walking near the kennels when the dogs somehow broke loose and attacked without warning. There had been no orders, no deliberate release, no tracking. It was described as a tragic accident, a failure of equipment, something unpredictable that could happen to anyone who owned hunting dogs. Samuel Hawkins was ordered to support this story and did so, knowing his job and possibly his life depended on it. Margaret, crushed by grief but dependent on her brother, reluctantly agreed to stay silent. The enslaved witnesses had no power to challenge the official account. Their words would not be accepted, and speaking the truth would likely bring severe punishment. Only one person refused to go along with the lie. Nathaniel Jr., just 15 years old and broken by the loss of his older brother, demanded that the truth be told. He had not seen the attack himself, but he had learned what really happened through overheard conversations and his understanding of how his father used the dogs. He knew William's death was not an accident, but the direct result of Nathaniel's choice to release trained attack dogs on his own son, and he wanted his father held responsible. The clash between Nathaniel and his second son caused deep cracks in the family that never healed. Nathaniel tried to force silence using the methods he always relied on: absolute authority, threats of cutting him off, and when those failed, physical intimidation. But Nathaniel Jr. showed a stubborn strength and moral clarity his father did not expect. He insisted that the truth mattered, that William deserved justice, and that the family could not simply pretend nothing had happened. The story tried to present the tragedy as if it were a simple accident, even though it was actually the direct outcome of the father's harsh and cruel behavior. By October 1, 1839, just 3 days after William died, the Harrington family was already in open turmoil. Nathaniel Jr. made it clear that he intended to tell the truth to any legal officials who looked into the matter. This statement forced Nathaniel to face the real possibility that his actions could lead to serious legal punishment. Under Alabama law in 1839, it was not illegal to train dogs to attack enslaved people. That kind of training was widely viewed as a normal part of exercising property rights. However, using those same dogs against a white person, even by mistake, was treated very differently. Using them against one's own son, even if the goal had been fear and control rather than killing him, could result in charges such as negligent homicide or even manslaughter. The official investigation that began on October 2, 1839 was weakened from the very start by strong social and political pressure meant to protect Nathaniel. The county sheriff, James Morrison, had business ties with Nathaniel and had borrowed money from him more than once. The county coroner, Dr. Edward Hayes, was socially friendly with Nathaniel and shared the same political loyalties the judge who would oversee any possible case, Samuel Randolph, owned a plantation himself and had previously spoken with approval about Nathaniel's methods of controlling enslaved people, including his use of trained dogs. Each of these men had personal, financial, or social reasons to avoid pushing for charges that would ruin a powerful planter. At the same time, they were facing pressure from Nathaniel Jr., whose insistence on honesty, along with concern from community members disturbed by the incident, could not be fully ignored. The result was a compromise in the form of a limited investigation. It admitted that certain parts of the case were troubling, but avoided any conclusion that would lead to criminal prosecution. During the inquiry, Samuel Hawkins gave testimony that carefully shaped events in a way that reduced Nathaniel's responsibility. He admitted that he released the dogs under Nathaniel's command, but claimed he believed the order was only to track William's location, not to attack him. He stated that the dogs acted in a new, unexpected way and went against their training when they attacked. This claim was intentionally misleading. The dogs had acted exactly as they had been trained to do, but this version of events offered legal protection for both Hawkins and Nathaniel. Margaret Harrington testified that she had not seen the attack itself and could only describe finding William already badly injured. She avoided any mention of what Nathaniel had told her about using the dogs or the conversations she overheard right after the incident. Nathaniel Jr. was not allowed to give formal testimony because of his age. At 15, he was considered too young under Alabama law to testify in court. This convenient legal rule kept the most damaging witness from speaking officially, even though his accusations spread informally and increased social pressure around the case. Several enslaved people were questioned during the investigation, but their statements were not officially recorded. Alabama law generally barred enslaved people from testifying against white individuals. Privately, the investigators noted in written memoranda that the accounts from these witnesses all agreed that the dogs had been deliberately released on Nathaniel's orders. However, this information could not be used in any formal legal setting. The investigation ended on October 15, 1839, with conclusions that recognized irregularities but avoided criminal charges. The official report stated that William Harrington died from injuries said by hunting dogs that attacked him under conditions showing poor restraint and supervision of dangerous animals. It said that Nathaniel Harrington was responsible for properly controlling his dogs and had failed to do so. As a result, the report recommended civil penalties rather than criminal ones. These included a fine of $500 for keeping dangerous animals without proper security, and an order that all dogs involved in the attack be destroyed immediately. There would be no criminal trial, no manslaughter charges, and no official admission that Nathaniel had intentionally set attack dogs on his own son. The 6 bloodhounds were destroyed on October 18, 1839, under the supervision of the county sheriff. Nathaniel was required to be present and watch as the animals he had trained for years were killed. These dogs had been a source of pride for him and symbols of his authority. Each dog was shot one by one, their bodies burned, and their existence erased from the Harrington plantation. For Nathaniel, this was more than the loss of valuable property. It was the destruction of a key part of his identity. The dogs had been extensions of his power and proof of his control. Their removal was a deeply symbolic defeat that he felt on a personal level. Still, the emotional harm suffered by Nathaniel was small compared to the complete breakdown of the family after William's death. Nathaniel Jr. never forgave his father and never accepted the official version of events. That downplayed Nathaniel's responsibility. The bond between father and second son was permanently shattered. Elizabeth Harrington, who was 13 at the time, pulled away emotionally from both parents and became quiet and withdrawn. Thomas, the youngest child at 11, was left confused and deeply traumatized as he watched his family fall apart. Margaret Harrington, torn between loyalty to her brother and horror at what he had done, suffered a nervous collapse in November 1839 and was sent to relatives in Virginia to recover for an extended period. The plantation itself began to decline as Nathaniel lost the focus and drive that had once made him successful. Cotton production fell sharply in 1840 and 1841. Nathaniel turned to heavy drinking and spent long days isolated in his study instead of managing daily operations. The enslaved people on the plantation, already traumatized by years of living under constant threat from the dogs, now faced an owner who was grieving and alcoholic. This made him even more unstable and dangerous than before. Several escape attempts took place in late 1839, and throughout 1840, encouraged by the absence of the dogs that had once made escape seem impossible. Without them, Nathaniel relied on traditional methods such as offering rewards, organizing patrols, and working with neighboring planters. These approaches were less effective, and several people successfully escaped to the north. Each escape was not only a financial loss, but also clear evidence of Nathaniel's fading control and authority. By early 1841, Nathaniel Harrington was a broken man overseeing a collapsing enterprise. His eldest son was dead. His second son refused to speak to him. His daughter and youngest son were emotionally scarred. His sister had left the plantation. His once efficient business was falling apart. Although the official investigation had protected his public reputation, those who knew the truth quietly judged him. The tragedy that began when he chose to unleash attack dogs on his own son had destroyed everything he had built. The final blow came in April 1841, when Nathaniel Jr., now 17, arranged to leave the plantation for good. He had secretly written to relatives in Virginia and secured their promise to take him in and support his education. His departure marked the final break in the family and the end of Nathaniel's dream of creating a lasting plantation dynasty. The sons who were meant to carry on the family legacy were either dead or estranged. The plantation that should have been passed down whole would now have to be sold or divided. Everything Nathaniel had worked for during 23 years of ruthless accumulation was undone by one decision to treat his own child with the same cruelty he had always used against enslaved people. Nathaniel Crawford Harrington died on September 15, 1841, nearly 2 years after William's death. The official cause was liver failure, made worse by long-term alcoholism, though many believed he had slowly drunk himself to death out of grief and guilt. He was 47 years old, the same age his own father had been at death. The probate records showed just how far his fortunes had fallen in his final years. The plantation, valued at about $110,000 in 1839, was worth less than $70,000 to $5,000 by 1841. Debts had risen to nearly $28,000, mostly due to operating losses and poor management. The number of enslaved people on the estate dropped from 127 in 1839 to 114 in 1841, the difference reflecting both successful escapes and sales made to cover expenses. The Greek Revival mansion that once symbolized success showed clear signs of neglect and delayed repairs. The remaining family members, Nathaniel Jr., Elizabeth, and Thomas, inherited portions of an estate that was far smaller than it had once been. Nathaniel Jr. took his share and moved permanently to Virginia, never returning to Alabama. Elizabeth married a merchant from Mobile in 1844 and left the plantation and its painful memories behind. Thomas, the youngest and the only son who kept any connection to the land, eventually sold the plantation in 1848, rather than trying to run it himself. The scattered money from the sale was divided among the siblings, none of whom ever lived on the property again. The enslaved people who had survived years under Nathaniel's brutal rule were sold at estate liquidation to different buyers, families torn apart, and their lives disturbed once more by the cold financial choices of a system that treated them as replaceable property. For these people, Nathaniel's death did not mean freedom. It only meant a transfer of power, a move from one owner to another with no promise that the new conditions would be kinder or safer than what they had already suffered. The physical remains of the Harrington plantation slowly fell apart in the decades that followed. The main house burned down in 1867, though no one ever confirmed whether the fire was accidental or intentional. The farmland was later merged into nearby properties or left unused. By the year 1900, almost nothing remained to show where one of Greene County's richest planters had built his wealth and destroyed his own household. Still, the story did not disappear. It survived in different ways, kept alive by different groups, each with their own reasons for remembering what took place. Among the white population, memories of the Harrington tragedy were shaped by unease, softened language, and eventual silence. Within the planter class of Greene County, Nathaniel's story was first spoken about quietly, usually as a warning about relying too heavily on harsh slave control methods. Some planters believed William's death proved that training dogs to attack people was reckless, no matter how useful it might have seemed for stopping escapes. Others dismissed it as simple misfortune, arguing that Nathaniel had only intended discipline and the outcome could not have been foreseen. Very few were prepared to admit the deeper reality that slavery itself depended on constant fear and violence, and that this violence would sometimes turn back on those who created it. Because facing this truth was uncomfortable, the story slowly faded from public discussion. By the 1850s, polite society in Greene County had mostly stopped talking about the Harrington incident. When Nathaniel was mentioned at all, it was usually to praise his former wealth, not to confront his moral collapse. The real details of William's death were hidden behind vague phrases like a hunting mishap or an animal incident, leaving out the deliberate dog training and Nathaniel's decision to use the animals against his own child. After the Civil War, as white Southerners began creating stories that softened slavery's cruelty and glorified plantation life, the Harrington story became even more inconvenient. It directly challenged claims that slaveholders were kind guardians who treated enslaved people like family. It exposed the violence required to keep slavery functioning. It showed how the desire for total control could become obsessive and destructive. For these reasons, the story was pushed out of official histories and public memorials of Alabama's plantation past. Members of the Harrington family helped in this silence, choosing forgetfulness over confronting what their ancestors had done. By the early 20th century, most white residents of Greene County had no idea what had happened on the Harrington plantation in 1839, and those who did know kept their memories private. In sharp contrast, the African American community actively preserved the Harrington story with care and intention. Enslaved people who had lived under Nathaniel's cruelty, who had seen William attacked, and who had endured a system that trained dogs to hunt human beings, passed the story down to their children and grandchildren. It became both a historical record and a moral lesson. In oral traditions shared by descendants of the enslaved people from the Harrington plantation and nearby farms, William's death served many purposes. It showed the real violence of slavery, directly opposing romantic stories about the past. It proved that brutality was not rare or accidental, but normal and necessary to the system. Most importantly, it showed that the violence aimed at enslaved people could come back on slaveholders themselves. The tools of terror they created could not always be controlled, and the moral rot at the center of slavery poisoned everyone involved. African American versions of the story kept details that white accounts erased. They remembered how Nathaniel trained the dogs, the names of enslaved people who were attacked before William's death, and the statements enslaved witnesses wanted to give, but were legally forbidden to share. They also described the daily fear and violence that shaped life under Nathaniel's rule. These memories included accounts of enslaved people who escaped after the dogs were killed, preserving their names, and, in some cases, the places where they finally found freedom that once seemed unreachable. At community meetings, churches, and family gatherings, the Harrington tragedy was retold as proof that resistance was possible. It showed that oppressive systems carried internal flaws, and that violence used by white people against black communities could sometimes turn back on those who used it, revealing the system's deep instability. The story also survived in written form. Several formerly enslaved people learned to read and write after the Civil War and recorded their own experiences or those of people they knew. At least 3 published slave narratives from Alabama mention Nathaniel Harrington's dogs, usually without naming him, describing the terror the animals caused and the relief felt when they were finally destroyed. One account, published in 1889 by a man who said he had been enslaved in Greene County, gives a detailed description of William's death, and clearly states that Nathaniel intentionally released attack dogs on his son after a family dispute. This written testimony supports the version of events that Nathaniel Jr. tried to present during the 1839 investigation, but was never allowed to formally state. The long-term effects of the Harrington tragedy on Alabama's plantation system were mixed and often conflicting. On one hand, William's death caused some planters to rethink the practice of training dogs specifically to attack people. A few plantation owners in Greene County and nearby areas decided not to copy Nathaniel's methods after seeing how they ended. This slightly reduced the use of one especially cruel technique within the much larger system of slavery. On the other hand, The weak investigation and lack of serious punishment for Nathaniel confirmed the deep legal protection enjoyed by white slaveholders. The message was unmistakable. Even when a planter's cruelty led to the death of his own son, the legal system would avoid real accountability. This confirmed for enslaved people that they could expect no justice from courts or officials, that violence against them would never truly be challenged, and that survival depended on their own acts of resistance and support rather than on law or authority. The rule against keeping dangerous animals that came out of the investigation was added to Greene County law, but it was applied unevenly and mainly used to settle disputes between white landowners, not to protect enslaved people. Planters continued to use dogs for tracking and intimidation, though with more caution to avoid harm to white individuals. The role of dogs as tools of fear within slavery stayed largely unchanged, with only small adjustments meant to prevent accidents. In the wider history of Alabama, the Harrington tragedy was a small event that barely appeared in official records or public memory. It did not change the course true teacher of slavery, did not lead to meaningful reform, and did not alter the path toward the Civil War that would eventually end the system. It was just one of countless acts of violence and moral failure that defined slavery. But for those directly involved, William who died, Nathaniel Jr., Elizabeth, and Thomas who lived on with lasting trauma, the enslaved people who suffered under Nathaniel's rule, and the communities who kept the story alive, the tragedy mattered deeply. Its impact did not fade with time. The physical traces of what happened on the Harrington plantation in September 1839 are gone. The house is gone, reduced to ashes long ago. The kennels where the dogs were kept have collapsed into dust. The field where William was attacked has been plowed and replanted again and again, wiping away all visible signs of the blood spilled there. Even the graves are uncertain. William was buried in what was believed to be a family cemetery on the plantation, but the exact spot has been lost, and modern development has covered any remaining markers. Yet the story remains because it carries meaning. It endures because it reveals truth, because it honors memory, and because it reminds future generations of the real cost of cruelty, silence, and power used without humanity. It matters as a record of how slavery brutalized every life it touched, not only the enslaved but also the enslavers, who allowed a system built on domination and violence to rot their humanity so deeply that they could treat their own children with the same harshness they used against people they claimed as property. It matters as proof of how systems of oppression create monsters, not because individuals are born evil, but because violence becomes normal and moral limits are slowly erased in ways that would never be acceptable in healthier societies. Nathaniel Harrington was not a strange outlier or a rare case. He was a predictable result of a system that depended on extreme violence to survive, that encouraged white men to hold absolute power over other human beings, and that placed almost no real limits on how that power could be used. It matters as a reminder that the violence slavery relied on could never be perfectly controlled or aimed only at those it was meant to harm. The attack dogs Nathaniel trained to terrorize enslaved people into obedience became weapons that could, and eventually did, turn on his own household. This was not poetic justice in any comforting sense. William's death did not free a single enslaved person or weaken the system in any real way, but it exposed a truth that defenders of slavery wanted desperately to deny. Violence and fear are unstable forces that put everyone at risk, including those who believe they can use such tools without consequences. It matters as evidence of resistance and survival by enslaved people who kept the real story alive, even when white authorities and families tried to bury it. The African American community's preservati of accurate historical memory about events like the Harrington tragedy served essential purposes. It honored those who suffered, challenged false stories about slavery, and protected knowledge of how the system truly worked rather than how its supporters claimed it worked. Holding on to truth in the face of attempted historical erasure is itself a form of resistance, and it continues to matter today in ongoing struggles over memory, justice, and racial equality. Finally, it matters because the basic forces that produced the Harrington tragedy, systems of control backed by violence, the dehumanization of targeted groups, the creation of tools of terror, and the moral decay of people who hold power without real limits, did not disappear when slavery ended. Learning how these forces worked in the past helps us recognize how they still operate in the present. even if they appear in different forms with familiar patterns underneath. The story of a wealthy planter who trained dogs to hunt human beings and then watched those same dogs turn on his own son is not just an odd historical detail. It is a warning about what happens when societies organize themselves around cruelty and oppression. The question that lingers over the Harrington tragedy is whether Nathaniel understood, during his final 2 years of decline and heavy drinking, what he had truly done and what it meant. Did he understand that William's death was not a random accident, but the direct result of his own choices and beliefs? Did he realize that the same cruelty that helped him succeed as a planter eventually destroyed his family? Did he ever see a connection between how he treated enslaved people and the tragedy that struck his own child? The historical record does not give clear answers. Nathaniel never made a public statement accepting responsibility beyond what the limited investigation forced him to admit. He never apologized to Nathaniel Jr. or tried to repair relationships with his surviving children. He never freed any enslaved people or rejected the system that had given him wealth and authority. His fall into alcoholism suggests guilt and despair, but whether that reflected true moral understanding or simply grief over losing his son and his hopes for a family legacy cannot be known for certain. What is clear is that Nathaniel never faced real justice. He paid a fine, he was ordered to destroy his dogs, he endured embarrassment and damage to his reputation among those who knew the truth. But he was never criminally tried, never imprisoned, and never held publicly accountable in a way that matched the full scale of his actions. The enslaved people who endured his cruelty for years received no compensation, no apology, and no recognition. The family members traumatized by William's death and its aftermath received no meaningful support beyond what they could offer one another. The system that allowed and encouraged Nathaniel's brutality continued on without serious reform. This way, the Harrington tragedy reflected how slavery functioned as a whole. Constant violence and cruelty sometimes led to shocking incidents that disturbed even those who defended the system. Yet these events almost never resulted in accountability or lasting change. They were explained away, hidden, or quietly forgotten by the white community, while being remembered and passed down as warnings by the black community that experienced slavery's violence most directly. The legacy of Nathaniel Crawford Harrington is, in the end, the legacy of slavery itself. It is a story of how the chase for wealth and power through oppression destroyed relationships, ruined families, created tools of terror that turned against their makers, and left scars that lasted for generations. His story deserves to be remembered not because he was unusual, but because he was typical, not because his tragedy was rare, but because it exposed patterns that defined the entire system. It is not a story meant to excuse or forgive, but to record and understand how such horrors become accepted as normal and how they eventually consume everyone involved. The 6 bloodhounds killed on October 18, 1839 were not the true monsters in this story. They were animals trained by a human being to serve a violent system. The real monsters were the people who built and defended that system, who called it natural and right, who profited from it while causing immense suffering, and who only occasionally paid a small fraction of the price their victims paid every day. Nathaniel Harrington trained dogs to hunt human beings, and one day those dogs attacked his own son. That is historical fact. But the deeper truth is that slavery trained people to treat one another with cruelty that destroyed the humanity of both the oppressed and the oppressor. Everyone paid the cost of that corruption in different ways and to different degrees. That truth matters just as much now as it did in 1839. That is why stories like the Harrington tragedy must be kept alive, remembered, and studied for what they teach about power, violence, justice, and the long shadows history leaves across generations.